when you really look out in the world, I think one of the challenges that people have is they think that there's only pleasure and there's only a good feeling associated with the positive things that people associate in their mind. So love feels good, and compassion feels good, and all these things feel good, and people are very identified with these positive emotions. But if the other stuff didn't have some dark, twisted pleasure, the feeling of oppressing somebody, it has a certain signature of pleasure to the ego. The feeling of being angry at someone, like the Buddhists call that the initial urge, that hook, the shempa, this rise of emotion, this feeling. And there's this kind of ejaculatory release that comes from destruction and anger and all of these negative emotions. And that's not just projected out to other people. There is this kind of twisted pleasure to actually desecrating the self. And I think people are really unaware that a lot of times we're choosing these things because in some twisted way, like it feels good to do these bad things. It feels good to oppress ourselves. It feels good to hurt ourselves in a weird, interesting way that's been being supported by the universal polarity of that kind of dark, destructive energy that's out in the world and also within us.
Yeah, you lost me at ejaculatory pleasure, and that was on the back of the Fellowship of the Ring. So, I mean, I'm not sure why I'm here today, but I feel like I'm being set up. Could you ask the question again? No, I mean, listen, there's the gamut of emotions, there's a gamut of experiences, and we could say that there is a certain addiction to all of it. But I would say that if there is a correlation between having some sense of association with more of the negative feelings, it's just the justification of one's perspective. That's all it is, right? So if somebody is drawn to enjoying, we could say, those darker emotions, all I hear in that is that they get to be right about their own view of themselves.
So the pleasure in that is that they're reinforcing some aspect of rightness about and justification for why they're doing it.
Yeah, it's not so much the attachment to the emotion, because that vibratory state isn't necessarily pleasurable, like objectively, but it is the payoff and the justification that how I see myself and how I define myself just got it was reinforced. Yeah. So it's just that. It's so basic when you look at it, but the ego's primary goal is just to be right about its own perspective. Yeah. So this is where, when people will say things like, I knew that would happen, or that always happens to me. That's no longer like an objective analysis of the unfolding of life. That's a subjective narrative that is constantly reinforcing its own perspective. That's all it is.
Yeah, and therein lies that kernel of pleasure, the pleasure of the ego being right, the pleasure of the one serving what one believes to be justice. Mm-hmm. This person is unworthy, so they deserve to be oppressed because I'm right, and it creates that superiority. It's not the actual doing it, or I'm right about this thing. I'm the one who's punishing myself, and I deserve this punishment. Yeah. And so it's not the feeling of punishment, because ostensibly, yes, that is a shitty feeling. Mm-hmm. But somewhere woven in is this little thread of the ego being able to say, aha.
Yeah. The way I categorize it is, I use a lot of quotes and distinctions. I say, being right is the poor man's version of self-worth.
Yeah.
Right. So if you really get that, it's like recognizing, wow, I might not get what I want, but I'm right about it. Mm-hmm. So I'll watch my life go to shit and I'll sabotage, and it's all these deleterious events that are unfolding. But nonetheless, I can stand in my self-righteousness, which is where I have the ultimate sense of power and control, even in the face of my own demise, which is just, that's how you see how mad. Like when I've done this for 3 decades now, that was the one thing that I was like constantly blown away by, is that people would rather absolutely sabotage their lives but be right about it.
What an amazing draw to be right. Like mm-hmm. how deeply ingrained is that in the human psyche, this desire to be right? Yeah. Like where do you track that foundation? Why is it that the ego so desperately craves to be right that they're willing to subject self and others to a veritable hell mm-hmm. in order to be right?
Well, because what happens to it if it's not right?
Well, then you have your own reevaluation of who you are, I suppose.
Yeah, which we could call what? Oh, I'm turning the tables. I like this.
Yeah. Well, all right. So in that reevaluation, it's a loss of identity.
You're
it's
right.
a loss of self.
So because you're smart, like, so beyond loss of identity, what's the lay way of saying that?
It's a lack of self-love based upon the predication of being right, it being, the necessity for being worthy of love and having worth, like you're saying.
Yeah. But again, like, let's keep it real basic. In the absence or the loss of identity, what is that? What's actually occurring? The loss of something, what's another word for that? And it's a topic of conversation right now around the world. Begins with D and ends in F.
Yeah. And in a way so if you look at that, like the ego is a fixed structure, it doesn't just change, it must die. Mm-hmm. And then the new one must be born. It's the phoenix. So it's not, I guess it's then looking at, this isn't just a modification. You're not just saying, oh, myself has shifted slightly. That fixed understanding of self dies, death. Mm-hmm. And then something new has to emerge. And we don't have faith that the new thing that will emerge is going to emerge, or it's the part of us that is in that fixed identity that just is desperately clinging to the life of the construct that we've created.
Yeah. So again, to come full, circle to why you asked, was your question of why it has to be right? Because by its nature, it's fictitious, it's illusory. So without having any sort of evidence or self-reaffirming kind of conversation, which is that self-righteousness, then it dissipates. And so who wants to die, right? But this is the beauty. I mean, we've gotten right into the depth of my work here, which is the annihilation or the disintegration, the dissolution of the idea of ourselves, which is emancipation and liberation. But that's the old adage of how do you pick yourself up by your bootstraps? Like the I that's looking for enlightenment is the very obstacle to enlightenment. Right?
Yeah.
So the I that is wanting to be right about its own identity is by design based in inadequacy, insecurity, scarcity. That's its structure, but it's always right about it. So then it's always perpetuating its own existence because it has to, because it's illusory.
Yeah.
It's the ultimate smoke and mirror. But people don't understand that what they want in their life is to be found on the other side of the constraints of their own idea of themselves.
Yeah, that's a really good way to understand this, actually, because, recently, myself and my lovely wife, we had a trivial disagreement that we both decided through our own unconscious processes we were going to drag out into a day-long affair in which we took some space and, we're both pretending that we didn't want to be right because that was our identity of ourself. Well, I'm not the one that wants to be right. I don't care about that. But nonetheless, we were still trying to be right in our own ways. And we drug this out. And at the end of it, we were laughing and saying, what is it? Do we have just a hell fetish? Do we have a fetish to put ourselves in this hell?
Yeah.
But really, it perhaps wasn't a hell fetish. We weren't attracted to, these feelings of separation, these negative feelings. What we were fighting for was the construct of ourself, which we believed was right, which we did not want to sacrifice to the altar of the truth and let it die so that the new one could emerge.
Yeah, which is why most relationships don't work. Because people aren't in a relationship with the other person, they're in a relationship with their own idea of themselves, and it's a self-preserving mechanism. So as long as you behave in the way that I like you to behave, then we get along fine. If you don't, then this relationship is on the rocks. Which is really, if you really get it, is it actually not a relationship with anyone else but your own fictitious idea of yourself, which is why most people can be married or in a relationship, yet they still feel lonely.
Yeah.
Because you're not actually related to other people or life itself, because you're looking through a lens that is all about adaptation to survival. And so in that trivial, I thought it was very polite, you just call it trivial, but whatever the disagreement was, there's really what's happening, if we call it what it is, it's just two children who are sulking.
Yeah, absolutely, man.
That's all that's happening.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
You're both hurt, and it's okay. You need a timeout. You didn't get the toy. You wanted this ice cream, and daddy said no, and and that's what happened. Right? Let's just call it what it is, And so you've got two adults who love each other, but they're being driven by these inner children who just got butt hurt.
Yeah.
We're back to the Fellowship of the Ring.
How did the Fellowship of the Ring become a euphemism for sodomy? I don't know how that.
You took it a little too far there. So that's all that's ever transpiring in a relationship that's not working or is dysfunctional, is the part of me that is on the precipice of being hurt at any given moment if you don't behave in accordance with the world according to me. That's the trigger. But that is also the access to liberation. Because if you can look at, okay, do I want to be right or do I want to love my wife? And at that time, you want it to be right, which is fine, but it's a very powerless place to be.
And self-defeating, radically self-defeating.
Yeah, that's the self-sabotage I was talking about earlier. It's like, wow, that's super inspiring. You were right about whatever inadequacy
Hooray.
you have.
And we just totally thrust ourselves into hell.
Yeah.
And then ultimately realized how foolish we both were the whole time, but it just took a long time. So, but this is very much at the forefront of people's resistance to change at all. Change for the better. It's not just acknowledging when we're wrong causing the death, but it could be even growth on the positive sense still requires a death of the self that exists, the construct that exists in the ego self.
Yeah.
If that's going to change for the positive, you still have to be willing to die. And if you're identified with the I that's at this fixed plane, even if you're going to an elevated plane and an evolution upwards, even still, that part has to die. And that part is going to be resistant to death, just like every single organism on the planet pushes against death.
Yeah. And because the primordial intention of any organism is to survive. So that's why there's so much resistance. But that resistance is the precursor to dis-ease, right? The holding, you can feel it, right? The holding. In that moment, you were not talking to the person you love perhaps arguably the most, or that's your declaration. And yet you are in this isolation chamber where you are resisting what is actually trying to be born here, which is forgiveness and apology, your humanity. It's okay. Like, it's not like you're supposed to be walking around like with white light coming through your genitals as this person who's in constant peace, Right. But can you make space for the part of you that gets hurt? Can you make space for the part of you that's scared? It's okay. So that primordial urge to be right, to survive, is ironically, that is the death of possibility. And so really my work speaks to the constant dying of one's idea of oneself such that you can actually be born anew.
Yeah.
It's no different to the snake that sheds its skin. It's no different to our physiology. I mean, we've been sitting here for 15 minutes. We both have different bodies. But we don't look at it like that, right? Because cells are dying, thank God, and then new ones are being born. But if we can take that same physical understanding, the principle of expansion and evolution itself, and apply it to the idea of myself, now that's a powerful trajectory to be on.
Yeah, it requires a shift of identification. There's a quote from Heraclitus: "No man steps in the same river, for he's not the same man, and it's not the same river."
Exactly.
Yeah. So if we understand that we're this being that's in flux rather than the fixed identity which the ego wants to cling to, like that's the shift in identity. And then at that point, there's even that other escalation of that shift to being the unborn, undying essence of consciousness that's embodied in a form that's constantly changing. If we identify with that, these deaths and rebirths are actually fluid and smooth, and all the corners that were jagged and sharp become rounded and smooth, and it becomes an actual flow.
Yeah. Did you notice what just happened?
I felt better.
No, well, I just died in front of you. I just wasn't sure if you were aware of it. But I'm back. It's okay.
Yeah, yeah. And that's
I'll probably keep doing it a few times. Yeah.
But even in the expression of it, it feels like, yeah, like that's it.
Yeah, that's relief. It's like in Hindu scriptures, they describe death as like taking off a tight shoe. Right? Like, so every woman can speak to that, at the end of a big night where she's wearing her heels, like the relief of that constraint. It's like, And so that really is just this ongoing opportunity. If you're willing to reconcile and mitigate all of these beliefs of who you are, to step into a different iteration of yourself that is more expanded. That to me is a life worth living.